Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here amidst this august group. And I'm going to talk to you today about our acceleration pipeline and what promoted it and inspired it. I want to acknowledge our collaborators. It definitely takes a village, with particular thanks to two very special collaborators who, on the different aspects of the translational pipeline, Dr. Danny Pine, who inspired me to take a look under the hood at neural processes when I was very behaviorally focused, and has led the way ever since. And Dr. J.D. Smith, who is an implementation scientist who prodded me saying, what the hell is developmental science waiting for? So I thank all of you. Very special thanks to the NIMH, whose funding has been an engine of much of this work, as well as the NIDCD and Ann and Robert Lurie Children's Hospital, no disclosures. So I'm going to talk to you about our mental health earlier conceptual framework, and then the foundational work that we have done methodologically to lay the groundwork for application. And then I just want to talk to you about the two applications for real world use that were mentioned, and then think with you about future directions. So why do we need to think about this melding with real world applications? This is a broad, well-known statistic outside of the neurodevelopmental sciences, which is that it typically takes 17 years or more to move from effective interventions into practice, and only 14% of interventions actually translate to real world use. And this is obviously, it's even slower to move the kind of discovery that many of us do in a way that actually affects children's lives. So it may be well beyond a person's career trajectory, even though we all put it in the discussion sections. It may be well beyond the trajectory of a person's career that their work actually matters in terms of improving children's health and mental health. And I think neurodevelopmental science is particularly siloed in the sense of real world translation to mental health promotion. And if you look at other fields, and I'm going to use an example in cardiovascular health, you can see where we really lag behind relative to many physical conditions where the state of the science informs standard practice on a daily basis. And my premise today is that implementation science is a rigorous methodologic approach that can help us close this knowledge gap by integrating what we know and the evidence base into policy, but most particularly today into real world practice. And I want to talk to you about the way that we're trying to do that with a few of our studies, and perhaps inspire some thinking of yours in your own work. The foundational principles were the impetus for us to start this Institute for Innovations in Developmental Sciences at Northwestern, whose theme is healthier earlier. And a major driving force about this was the idea that one reason we're siloed, we don't think we are because we're all very collaborative, but we're still within the boundaries of the naturally occurring collaborations of our disciplines. So we kind of go with adjacent neighbors, but we don't think about the people who live in the next neighborhood over who have much to bring. And this Institute for Innovations in Developmental Sciences, or DevSci, is about linkage of pediatricians, obstetric gynecologists, implementation sciences, neuroscientists, biosensing experts, et cetera, so that we can get ourselves into that space where most innovation really happens, which is at the boundaries of disciplines, most impactful innovation. So what do we mean by healthier earlier? Really kind of some basic principles that I think are important as we think about this work together. Obviously, many of us through NIMH, RDoC framework, et cetera, has helped us to move away from thinking about discrete categorical disorders to more an emerging and unfolding clinical sequence But we're also talking about something that I think is really important. For a long time, certainly when I entered the field, there was a notion that there was so much developmental noise in this early phase of the sequence that we needed to just skip over it. And you can open your DSM-5 today and you will still see many disorders where identifying them under 5 is precluded. And so what we're really promoting is, instead of erasing this and just looking away, we're promoting the idea that one takes longitudinal change and this normative atypical spectrum and harness it in methodology so that we can take it into account to be more sensitive and reliable in identifying the science of when to worry, which I'm going to talk about. So this also requires a transdiagnostic approach when we're thinking about early childhood, and joint consideration of brain behavior and context to help us really understand the individual differences. There's so much heterogeneity. That's what's gotten in the way in the past, and we're asking that we embrace that. We're also really suggesting earlier that we think that early childhood, during this early unfolding, is really critical. But thinking even before that, thinking in what in cardiovascular field they call primordial prevention, thinking preemptively. For example, how can we improve the gestational environment and reduce the adverse exposures that might lead to the vulnerability part of this pathway? We also want to begin to think outside of the narrow confines of our experimental labs to translatable, scalable activities that can lead to population-based applications, to focus on self-regulation as a broad domain that underlies so much of the common and modifiable psychopathologies, and also really be thinking about preventing or forestalling the onset of these chronic problems, because we know that even if we have a later onset, that it will reduce the severity and the impact of the course, and also be collaborating with real world health settings as we think about these things. And I would just say on the mental health earlier side that the watch and wait prevailing notion within clinical care and primary care pediatrics is related to this idea that there's so much noise and worry about early premature labeling and all of that, that it gets in the way of harnessing this early period of neuroplasticity. And there's no guideposts really for primary care providers who are telling parents to wait till a child is 6 when they're showing early dysregulatory problems, because they don't know how to make these decisions. They don't have milestones and decision aids. And so a lot of our work is trying to use evidence and applied science to move from this prevailing notion of watch and wait to this paradigm coined by my colleague, Amy Finley-Jones, to identify and act. And so what we need is rigorous ways to identify in a way that reduces false positives, which is the greatest concern that people have, premature labeling of somebody who's going to have natural course remission, and also methods by which to act. And this is where I want to just give you a sense of just how behind we are in the mental health field. Many of you may be familiar with, for example, the Framingham risk calculator, also known as the pooled cohort risk equation now in cardiovascular disease. You may have used it yourself, or your physician may use it. And this uses principles, what are behavioral principles known as the simple 7 in cardiovascular health, to calculate an individual's risk of heart attack or stroke over the next 10 years. And I want to note, because we're going to give examples of application of this risk calculator idea later, that in the cardiovascular world, this is standard practice. And at 7.5% risk, this is a guide to action. Less than 10% risk means that preventive actions are kicking in. And through our DevSci Institute, as I began to collaborate with other fields, including cardiovascular epidemiologists, I thought, what are we waiting for? And I remember an early conversation with Joan Luby about this. We know so much in the neurodevelopmental field. And as you know, Joan has written about busting that myth about they'll grow out of it. And we both kind of shrugged our shoulders and said, we got to do something. But we didn't really have a roadmap. We didn't have the tools, but we had this as an example. Imagine if we could employ these methods developed by epidemiologists for prognostication. And instead of, as they are currently doing, using this to look at risk starting at age 40, we could do it at age 4 or even earlier. I think the science is there. We need to get there through rigorous application and methods. So I'd really encourage any of you who haven't seen this to look at this article by Alex Ramsey and his colleagues, which was pointed out to me by my collaborator, J.D. Smith. And the whole premise of this is a method called DART, Designing for Accelerated Translation. And Dr. Ramsey's point is we have a mistaken notion in the field that we only base our ideas about when we're ready to take something into the real world. We base our decisions on, how strong is the evidence base? Is it, rock solid, airtight? Do we know everything? Have we gone from efficacy to effectiveness and all those traditional things? And instead, Dr. Ramsey is proposing this equation. Oh, didn't mean to do that. This equation that helps us balance in order to accelerate pace. And the main notion of this DART framework is that we know a lot more than we think we do, and that we should treat application as part of building the evolving evidence base as opposed to its endpoint. And so he proposes this equation where we determine when we're ready as a function of the effectiveness or the strength of the evidence base, how important it is, what the demand is, what are the risks of taking action, and versus inaction, and what would the cost be at many levels. So the DART framework is, I think, really, really helpful in thinking about that. And I would contend that we are really ready. I haven't actually done the calculation as a math calculation, but I think that when you apply Dr. Ramsey's DART equation here, the neurodevelopmental field over the past decade and a half has made enormous strides in developmentally sensitive characterization of this early vulnerability phase of both brain and behavioral methods. We also have the tools of computational psychiatry preparing us for big data, because the thing about this kind of predictive methodology is that we need large populations in order to account for the heterogeneity. And the science is there. We just have to be ready to take the leap. I want to just talk about these key constructs to get us out of our traditional way of thinking about disorders and more into this probabilistic framework that are very, very key to thinking about translation for prevention in this early life period. So one of the key constructs is neurodevelopmental vulnerability. So we stop thinking about this, do you have it or do you not? And think about, do you have a pattern of behavior and ultimately subserving neural atypicalities that increase the risk, the likelihood that you will develop impairing psychopathology sometime in the future. Our own work right now is focusing on prediction to early childhood, although I will show you some preliminary data predicting to pre-adolescence. And we are centering on a vulnerability phenotype of emotion dysregulation and irritability in particular. There's extensive work in this arena showing that this and deficits in self-regulation are the most robust neurobehavioral pattern predicting health or maladaptation across the across the life course. And of course, what's really, really critical is that we can identify, even beginning at birth, and that it is a transdiagnostic indicator. The other construct, which I mentioned before, is the idea of probabilistic risk. We're not talking about diagnosing a child. We're saying, what is the probability that this child will have impairing mental health problems based on the current pattern? Remember that 7.5% risk determination in the cardiovascular calculator. And then finally, we're talking about a clinical outcome. When we're predicting risk, we're not talking in a disorder specific way or a syndrome specific way. That is both limiting if you want to apply at the population level, because nobody's going to be doing screening for every single narrowband disorder, but also because it may be when we're talking about neonates and infants and toddlers, that these are very overlapping, and what we can best do and what we want to target is these deficits in emotion dysregulation that are not specific to a particular disorder. Of course, you could always have layering on of additional specific types of interventions. So neurodevelopmental vulnerability as emotion dysregulation, using that as a basis for determining probabilistic risk and looking to this P factor, this general risk of impairing psychopathology. So first, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Discovery Foundation and the work we did in order to be able to measure this construct of neurodevelopmental vulnerability. Because when I entered the field, and that may be true of others, we were told it is impossible to tell the difference between when a child is at risk and when it's just normative variation. And so a lot of my work has focused on developing the science of when to worry. So why irritability? First of all, it's very, very salient. Have you ever seen a tantrum at the grocery store? It's salient to parents, it's salient to pediatricians, it's salient to daycare providers, and so it would really lend itself to identification and screening. And it's also a very defining feature of irritability, which is the best early transdiagnostic predictor of both internalizing and externalizing problems, which are the most common and modifiable early onset disorders. Obviously, it also is a feature of many, many disorders, and is linked to the frustrative non-reward element within RDoC. And I think when I entered the field, the problem was, the terrible tooth. It's a defining feature of the normative misbehavior, see Calvin and Hobbes. So we needed to find ways to be able to tell this difference. And so we used theory and developmental science and clinical knowledge to define what these features were that would help us know when to worry. And in broad strokes, we're talking about the quality of the behavior. It's dysregulation, it's responsiveness to the environment, whether it occurs in contexts that are developmentally expectable or not, and that it occurs perhaps frequently, but it does not predominate in the child's behavior. And we developed 3 methods to look at this. We developed basically an early childhood irritability toolkit. And I'm going to talk briefly about the DBDOS measure, which is a way to look at the child's capacity to self-regulate across demand contexts. So that's a direct observation, not that pragmatic, as we talk about what's practical for real world use, but enables us to see contextual variation and also to examine the parent's behavior, and also the MAPDB measure, which is a measure of irritability, which is a survey. The main thing I want to say about the DBDOS is that it's proved very informative as we think about cross-contextual variation and what that in child's behavior, even in the context of a lab or a home setting and a brief observation, that the child's capacity to regulate with parent versus non-parental adult has proven very informative, including in clinical trials, and also in work that we're doing with Elizabeth Norton at Northwestern, and that Susan Perlman's lab has done now at WashU. We are using it as the DBDOS as a platform to be able to look at how dyads are synced from a neural perspective during these very contexts as a neural synchrony platform. And these are just moving to the MapDB survey, the kinds of behaviors. We learned a lot from the observation in the DBDOS, but as I said, you need something quick and efficient when you're talking about scalability. And so a lot of what we learned was translated to this questionnaire, which now spans actually from the neonatal period with developmental adaptations. And the way that we validated this was thinking of using large scale pediatric samples to be able to say, where do we see deviation from what is typical at this age period? And so you can see that the kinds of items that we're tapping into are things like not being able to recover from a tantrum, being highly dysregulated and biting somebody during a tantrum, occurring in contexts that typically occur, like when a child is frustrated, but also out of the blue or for no reason. And so what we have here is what I believe may be the first normal abnormal spectrum characterization psychometrically of irritability. And this is a graph, a psychometric IRT graph. And what it's showing us is that where that arrow is, shows you when behaviors become severe or atypical, at what point. And you can see that in the bottom rectangle, there's a lot of behaviors that you would expect, like having a tantrum with your parent or when you're tired, but that there are other behaviors that rarely occur in children, crying for more than 5 minutes and being unable to be calmed or redirected. And so this gives us that actual operationalization of the spectrum. I'll also mention in work led by Susan Perlman's lab, some really interesting work that Adam Grable did. And this is a graph from a NEAR study in which children were administered the MapDB irritability scale, and they also engaged in a frustrating task called the fetch. And what was interesting about this is that what they detected was that irritable children who were not, it was an inverted U pattern, so that irritable children who were not impaired it had high activation of the DLPFC, showing that they were working hard to regulate their frustration. But low irritable children and irritable children who were impaired showed a similar pattern of low activation. So it wasn't kicking in for those impaired children, the DLPFC activation. And interestingly, the point at which the inverted U begins to go down is maps on very closely to the point at which the survey reaches its irritability clinical threshold. So now I want to talk about the risk calculator grant, the mental health earlier synthetic cohort study that collaborators Joan Luby and Cynthia Rogers and I are leading, an NIMH funded study on which Deanna is also a collaborator. And here we have the DART equation. And I would say just quickly, because many of you are probably familiar with this, that there's robust evidence of the validity of internalizing and externalizing psychopathology by the age of 3. And that we know that the prevalence is very similar to that in older children, as are the continuities and discontinuities. And we also have evidence from work of Jim Heckman and others that intervention at this early stage, now his work is focusing preschool, but even at preschool age, that we see that the lifelong savings that are predominantly the mechanism they've shown is through irritability and other externalizing behavior reduction is profound in public health cost. The challenges of doing this, the cost, the risk, is that we do have to worry about stigma. And I've always thought about it as a life opportunity rather than a life sentence, as people resisted this idea of earlier intervention. But as our own lens has sharpened around inequities, it's become clearer to me that we do have to really think about whether this early identification may have greater costs for children of color, and if so, what kind of steps would we need to take to ensure that that's not the case? So I'm first going to quickly just tell you about preliminary data from the MHESC grant that we did prior to getting that grant, with study from WashU, harmonizing a study from WashU, the PDS, led by Deanna and Joan, and our MAP study. And what we were looking, we harmonized these two preschool studies. The risk calculator, the MHESC grant, is focused beginning at birth, but this was with preschool to pre-adolescent, looking at neurodevelopmental indicators and environmental adversity and other indicators of development as predictors of pre-adolescent psychopathology, using epidemiologic discrimination statistics that tell us which domains add clinically meaningful value in predicting probabilistic risk. And so one of the things I like about this model, the whole idea here is being pragmatic. So we move away from p-values and statistical significance to say what has added value from a clinical perspective using these discrimination indices, rather than just what is a significant predictor. In the cardiovascular world, this approach has led to their focus on the simple 7 behavioral predictors, even though genetic and physiologic indicators are significantly associated with cardiovascular risk, but they're more resource intensive and less easily scalable, and they don't add, once you've taken the behavioral indicators into account, probabilistically. And so here we use the sequential modeling, looking at irritability and depression. We then layered in childhood exposure to adverse childhood experiences and observed parental responsiveness, and then developmentally cognitive abilities, and then looking probabilistically at the risk of preschool internalizing, externalizing problems. And what we found is that irritability, childhood ACEs were the 2 predictors that helped us identify the best model. We want to be explaining the most area under the curve. And once we had taken those into account, which is shown in model 2, which is the pink line, the other models that added things like cognition and observed parenting did not significantly improve the model. But when you looked at that cardiovascular calculator, that was personalized. So we want to know not only what predicts, we want to know what matters for whom. And so we are able to take these models and say, for example, for boys, that if we compare non-poor and poor boys, that poor boys are at more risk. But then when we layer in ACEs, we see that the probability goes from 17 to 25%. So it's increasing. But then when we look at, these are ACEs. But what's most important, I think here, one of the most important things is that the greatest risk, more than doubling, is when a child is irritable, they more than double their risk. And for boys, we see that if a boy is poor and he has exposure to ACEs and irritability, he has more than 70% risk as a preschooler of developing pre-adolescent psychopathology. Similar patterns for girls, although as in psychopathology patterns, risk is lower in general for girls. And so now I'm going to talk about where we're going with this. This is our recently funded NIMH MHESC grant. And the idea is to develop a personalized algorithm for developing a risk calculator for use in real world settings. And it integrates both epidemiologic risk prediction, as kind of we've been talking about, and machine learning computational methods led by Josh Swamidas at WashU, and using this novel synthetic cohort method. And so I've already talked about a framing principle here, which is probabilistic risk, but we're also introducing this novel harmonization method developed by Nori Allen, our colleague and collaborator at Northwestern, which uses multiple imputation very rigorously to get around the fact that in traditional harmonization, there's a tremendous amount of missing data. And that means that is really, really negative for modeling nonlinear patterns and the heterogeneity of neurodevelopment. We will, of course, have rigorous validity checks on that, but this is a particular innovation that we think will increase our power for individualized, personalized prediction. I think I've talked about most of this. One thing we're excited about, I'll just say again, around the operationalization of RDoC type constructs, is that we'll be able to look at where a child falls on a dimension and whether different predictors are relevant depending on the severity, for example, of your irritability. We will also be taking assets and developmental context into account, and we can also do things like test whether accounting for longitudinal variation improves sensitivity and specificity. And just to tell you, across these samples that we have an N of 1,020 children across the early childhood period. And these were sampled in different ways. And that I think it's the first of its kind really with deep phenotyping observationally with EEG and MRI, as well as deep phenotyping of the clinical outcomes at preschool age. And just very quickly, what we're trying to do here is develop a series of algorithms. So the most efficient, based only on survey data, that could be scalable to primary care use for this infant risk calculator predicting to early childhood mental health risk. But then we want to test, well, what about for a mental health specialty clinic? What if we added direct observation or performance-based tasks of executive control? Would that improve sensitivity and specificity, and for whom? And then, sorry, it should be the first and third aim. Our third aim is to model after traditional neurodevelopmental consortia and to see if we use surveys plus imaging without those intermediary performance-based tasks, can we improve prediction? And we will validate those in collaboration with Jed Ellison and the Baby Connectome project. I'm going to go on to this next application. So that is an early identification tool. Remember, identify and act, but we're also engaged in the act part. And this starts even earlier. This is a project funded by Lurie Children's Hospital, Stanley Manny Institute. And this is based on the knowledge that we have that is extremely robust, that early life stress is perhaps the best ecological predictor of mental health and health across the lifespan. And that if we can improve the gestational environment, we theorize that we can reduce neurodevelopmental vulnerability, because we have both from basic science and human studies a robust evidence base of the links between early life stress to emotion dysregulation in early childhood and beyond. This too is a personalized prenatal prevention. We're targeting perceived stress in the mothers, because lots of other things like famine and COVID-19 and life events are very stressful, but they're not directly modifiable. And also there are a number of evidence-based interventions for modifying prenatal stress. We're using biobehavioral monitoring due to our theory that changing the gestational environment would require monitoring of physiologic stress. And this is a study that we're doing in 100 diverse pregnant women recruited from obstetric clinics following their infants through the age of 24 months. And so the first part of the study is that we're screening for perceived stress, and then we modified an intervention called the Mothers and Babies intervention to include mindfulness and to be more personalized. And we're delivering this over 12 sessions. And what we did is we're using something called a biostamp, a biosensor, in which we are monitoring mother's stress based on an algorithm that combines EMA text messaging about stress with the physiology to create an algorithm that says this mom is currently stressed. And then in addition to the traditional sessions that she's receiving online, she will receive moms are receiving personalized text messages to use those techniques. So it's based on physiologic and self-reported stress in real time. And then this is just an example of the kind of messaging that moms are receiving. And then we will follow the babies from birth through 24 months, including these neurobehavioral observations, such as the DB-DOS and the MAP-DB, as well as EEG and natural sleep MRI. And this is also a study that is a feeder study for the MHESC, because why should anything go for only one purpose? And so in conclusion, I would say there is much to do. The gaps are great. The tools are there if we just know how to build these bridges. I would strongly contend that although we don't know everything, we know enough to take the leap, that pragmatic methods are key, and that the frontier is waiting for us to harness the power of our work to improve the mental health and health of young children and families. Thank you.